Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Paul Nathanson, who is an academic and an author and a key thinker in male studies. He's also on the advisory board of malestudies.org, and you can find out more about that work at malestudies.org. He's the co-author, along with Catherine K. Young, of Legalizing Misandry: From Public Shame to Systemic Discrimination Against Men. Paul Nathanson joins me to speak about misandry and gynocentrism and the myth of patriarchy. His is a gentle and studied mind, and we delve into these topics with much considerate aplomb. Without further ado, here is Paul Nathanson. Why did you devote your life to studying men, and what did you learn?
Well, I didn't really choose this topic. You might have heard this comment before from other people. I think that it chose me because I could have had a very good life studying film history and analyzing beautiful movies. But I switched because there was something compelling me to switch. And that really goes back to my childhood. I grew up being an outsider, realizing much later, of course, that I was gay. And I didn't really understand what being a man was. I mean, my father presented an image that I admired a great deal, but I didn't see how I could ever be like him in that way. So I spent my years in the wilderness really trying to figure out what I was or who I was. The first stage in my journey in that respect was to become a feminist, because I thought, well, if feminists are going to re-examine the meaning of something like sexuality and gender, then it stood to reason that men would gain, as well as women, by taking apart some of the things that I found unintelligible and not at all to my liking. But I found after reading feminism, that this was I began in the 1960s after Betty Friedan's book came out. But I continued reading, and in the 70s, I began to realize that something was going wrong, because feminist books and articles were filled with hostility and negativity toward men. And I just thought, look, that can't be right. That didn't fit in with my value system or the way I had grown up. And I just couldn't understand what was going on. Why was there all this hatred? I mean, I can understand the need of women for changes of various kinds. But the level of hostility grew and grew throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s. And by that time, I realized that not only could I not be a feminist, but that I would have to oppose it at some level. And what I opposed was not the early egalitarian feminism, which is part of the political language that I'm familiar with, but something else that I called ideology. So I talk about ideological feminism or feminist ideology as distinct from, the egalitarian urge that many women, even today, probably feel. So I'm separating out a particular kind of feminism, and it's probably a minority among feminists, but, and here's the important thing, it's also, I think, by far the most influential kind of feminism. This is the kind of feminism that prevails not only on university campuses, but in all the fields that trained academics move into. So it prevails in law schools. It prevails in schools of social work. It prevails in just about every field, every academic field, and therefore on society as a whole. In the 1980s and 90s, I was doing my doctoral work on popular movies as what I call secular myths. A secular myth is a kind of contradiction in terms, because a myth is by definition a sacred story, and secularity by definition rejects the idea of the sacred. But I call them secular myths because they function in very much the same way. They don't mediate the sacred, it's true, but secular myths are like other myths, traditional ones, in the sense that they're collectively owned stories about the human condition as it is and how it got here and where it might go in the future. It's about, there are myths, or secular myths, like other myths, are stories about going home and growing up and coming of age and the origin of evil and all this kind of thing. But they're told in symbolic language. So once I made the connection between secularity and myths, I then began to realize that there's another phenomenon closely related that I called secular religion. And here we have not only myths and not only rituals, but an entire worldview that is articulated through social and political and economic categories, all of which function very much the way religion functions, except that they don't mediate the sacred. So religion, organized religion, is a way of organizing society, for example. It has political implications, economic, and what have you. Now, my case study in looking at secular religions was feminism as a secular religion. That is, feminist ideology as a secular religion. And in fact, not just a secular religion, but a secular religion of a distinctly fundamentalist kind. Okay, so there are many kinds of religion. There's mythical, there are many kinds of religion. But the thing that we now call fundamentalism, which is a characteristically modern kind of religion, in the sense that it originates as a rejection of modernity and everything that goes with modernity, and I, with my co-author Catherine Young, began working on what originated as a single book on misandry and on secular feminism as a secular religion. It turned into 4 volumes, and 2 volumes are still unwritten. So we have 4 volumes instead of 1, because we had so much material to work with.
What's the operating principle of what you're calling feminist ideology? What's its characteristics and its fundamental axioms? Yeah.
Well, we defined 8 characteristic features, defining features. The most important by far is what is known as dualism. Dualism is a way of thinking that goes back to ancient times, and particularly to the Near East in the Greco-Roman period.
You thinking Gnostics, or are you thinking Zarathustrianism?
Well, both, and okay. Manichaeism.
Yeah, Manichaeism.
They're all based on the idea that history and the world are titanic struggles between us and them. We are good, they are evil. And in the end, of course, we, the good, will triumph. But that's basically dualism. And dualism seeped into both Judaism and Christianity. Jews were exiled in Babylon, and Christians were influenced by various mystery cults and Gnostic groups. So that was all part of the ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman worldview by the first century. So we do have strands in Judaism and Christianity that are clearly dualistic. But on the other hand, there's one important resource that these traditional religions have, and that is the prophetic tradition. And that refers to not only the books called the prophets, but the whole mentality in which the source of evil is not out there, it's in here. So it's not enough to denounce the nasty old Egyptians and Assyrians. It's also necessary to denounce our own corrupt kings and our own corrupt society. So that mentality is a resource along with the dualistic parts. And I think that it's important for everyone, especially people who call themselves Jews and Christians, to make that differentiation, because it's there. You can see it.
Mm-hmm. So that prophetic tradition starts by allowing for the state or the society or the clan and the clan leadership to be criticized, but then it further develops into self-criticism, correct? Like that
Yes.
would be where with Jesus, his statements
Yes.
pointing towards the heart, towards the individual becomes more and more responsible, and
Exactly.
good and evil are fighting inside.
And that mentality continues in Christianity, but also in Rabbinic Judaism. Both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity are the result of religious revolutions, or at least reformations. And they're neither is synonymous with ancient Israelite religion, although they have a common source. But they came to similar conclusions about the location of evil and how to deal with it.
And what would be how to deal with it in the prophetic tradition? Self-discipline, I guess the right of confession, perhaps the asking of forgiveness, that strain of...
Well, it certainly comes out liturgically. The Jewish liturgies are filled with references to this ideal world, beyond time, beyond history, eschatological, but nevertheless a model for how we are to go about creating a society right now. So we're living in a microcosm of this ideal cosmos, and that cosmos relies on the idea certainly on the idea of compassion, for example.
Yeah.
In the Christian case, the crucifixion is seen as a kind of atonement for the sins of everybody. And sin, by the way, is not just evil. It's not a moral category. It ultimately refers to separation from holiness.
Okay.
So both traditions have managed to define the sacred or holiness in ways that are beyond any kind of dualism. In fact, quite the contrary. The whole point of experiencing holiness, whether as a mystic or as an ordinary person, the whole point is to get beyond this kind of us-them mentality and to have a sense of belonging, being at home in a cosmos, a living cosmos.
Okay. So I want to get to a place where we can define fundamentalism and then get back to feminist ideology and how it manifests itself as some sort of reaction to modernity. But before we go there, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how the Christian idea of sin being a separation from holiness and the atonement through Christianity and through forms of and through Judaism towards a state of holiness, how that led or informed modernity. Or how does that work within a secular framework? How did
Well,
how did secularism come to be within that framework, that Western framework?
I would say that the first stirrings of what eventually became modernity occurred in the Protestant Reformation, because the Reformation separated, they reinterpreted the sacrament, for example, not as an experience, a kind of a preview of the world to come or the kingdom, and not only as a memory of the Last Supper, but they interpreted it as in a purely symbolic sense. So the wine does not actually become the blood of Christ, and the bread does not actually. They're symbols. They're reminders of something. But and so that was the first step, I think, in the secular intruding into religion. So what happened in Protestantism, and to some extent, or at least in some Protestant circles, is that religion, after 300 or 400 years, became heavily moralistic. In other words, so sin is reinterpreted as evil, and evil in turn could be reinterpreted as psychopathology or whatever modern psychologists or sociologists try to reduce it to. So that was the first step, I think.
So it was kind of like a literal sin, but a formal sin of a very definite separation from the holy by reducing that transaction to a metaphor, to a symbol. So it's starting to take a removed stance from the story, the framework of Christianity, let's say, as this living, huge, organic thing that connects us to the past and to the future and to heaven, and it starts to remove us into more realistic terms. It starts to separate us from metaphor.
Yes, those are words you could use. Okay. I think for many Protestants, it's focused heavily on morality, either personal morality in connection with usually things like sexuality, or collective morality in terms of social justice movements and movements of that kind.
Mm-hmm. And does modernism, in your sense, lay the groundwork for fundamentalism, the reaction to modernism, because there's that gap now where the religious imagination has no place to land?
Yes, I think that fundamentalism it began directly as a response, a reaction against modernity. So they began to assert, the inerrancy of Scripture, for example, and they separated themselves from any kind of interpretation that they could not see literally. I don't think that there's more to fundamentalism than that, but that's the origin as a reaction against modernity. And in a way, you can look at that as a kind of negative thing. A reaction is not a good word. It's not a nice word. But there are things about modernity that require some kind of response or rejection, because not everything about modernity is self-evidently attractive. Modernity includes, it's a secular world. And by secular, I don't mean profane. The sacred and the profane go together. They're intertwined. It's a dialectical relationship. But secularity rejects both the sacred and the profane. That's what makes it secular.
Okay. Yeah, it's a hermetically sealed worldview. It stands beyond good and evil. Yeah. So you mentioned the word dialectical. There's a dialectical relationship between the sacred and the profane, but there's a dualistic relationship in this other. Is there? What could you define the difference between the dialectics of sacred, profane, and then the dualism that is in this other
Well,
tradition?
the dualism is an objectification and externalization of evil. So evil isn't in here. It's not my fault. It's them. It's those people over there.
Okay.
And we have to somehow or other destroy or conquer or get rid of them. But the sacred and the profane are both equally necessary. The profane refers to the ordinary world of everyday life. The ordinary. It's not bad. It's not good. It's just ordinary.
It's messy.
And, But the profane is also the vehicle through which we can perceive the sacred. So when you take a cup of wine and put that in a ritual and mythic context, the wine becomes the vehicle of the blood of Christ.
Okay.
So neither can exist without the other.
Okay. Yeah. Whereas in dualism, there's a contradiction because it can't exist without that other, but it wants to eradicate the other, but then it would probably proceed to other itself, or that othering would never stop in dualism.
Yes, that's what I would say.
There's no ultimate liberation.
Well, I mean, if your religion is dualistic, then you do have the hope that someday, preferably sooner rather than later, we will have this final cosmic battle, and the followers of the good God will win, and the followers of the bad God will lose. Mm-hmm. The good God might be called the God of Christianity, and the evil God might be called Satan or Lucifer or what have you. But there are two principles that are in opposition, eternal opposition to each other.
Okay. So there's no hope of reconciliation, only annihilation.
That's right.
Okay. So how does that map onto what you call feminist ideology?
Well, one of the things that I noticed certainly in the 80s, is that feminist ideologues were creating a new version of the biblical myth. And by myth, I'm not using that word as a pejorative. It doesn't mean a lie. It doesn't mean stupid. It's just a story. Mm-hmm. Now, so the new story reversed the story of, creation and the garden, the expulsion from the garden, because in traditional versions, although not explicitly in the biblical text itself, but in later interpretations, the guilt for temptation and the fall fell to some extent, or even heavily, on women. Women were associated with Eve, and Eve was associated with the first temptation, and she seduced Adam. The biblical text doesn't put it that way, but you could draw that conclusion. But in any case, if you're a feminist and you see all of history as this search for female liberation, then you can have a story in which, in the beginning, take the words from Genesis. In the beginning, there was a paradise, and it was a paradise that of equality between the sexes. There was no war. There was no conflict. It was just harmony and all the good stuff, caring and sharing and loving and what have you, under the aegis of a great goddess. So they begin with the assumption that the first religion, the original religion, was a goddess cult. They never explained why a goddess cult would not favor women in similar ways to the ways in which a male deity might inspire patriarchy. But they never really answer the question, because if this was a world dominated by women and by a goddess, then what kind of identity could be had if you were a man? It's a question that has never really been answered. But I'll continue the story. The story continues. Okay. They're in the garden, everybody living happily, and then suddenly there's either a revolution from within by men, or there's some invasion from without, led by men, and bringing in their male deities. So either way, the initial paradise, the idyll, is destroyed. And that's the beginning of patriarchy. And we go through history continually feeling the reverberations of that original sin. And in the end, however, they argue that there will be a return to paradise. Of course, it'll be a feminist paradise.
So there will be the eschaton, if I'm correct, will be a return to the goddess.
Exactly. Okay.
So the patriarchy is then the demiurge, or the fallen god, and is responsible for all of the fallenness in this particular timeline. Okay.
That's right.
And so how do they proceed then to smash or dismantle or prepare the way for the goddess? Smash and dismantle the patriarchy and prepare the way for the goddess. How does that operate or work out?
Well, they're the same, really, because in order to prepare the world for a goddess or a paradise regained, you have to destroy what is current. Now, that's the key correlation between ideological feminism and wokism, because wokism is not a reformation, it's a revolution. The idea is that the current world order must be destroyed, root and branch, in order for the new order, the return to paradise, on top of the ashes of the old. And also, and there are many other parallels. I mean, wokism simply absorbed feminism. It's not as if wokism has transcended or overcome feminist ideology. It simply incorporated it. Which is why you have the two chief problems or signs of sin. One of them being racism, the other being sexism. But by sexism, of course, they mean misogyny. They don't care about misandry, which coexists. And so my research has been on the misandric fallout of feminist ideology.
Okay.
Because at that time, nobody had ever heard of misandry, and anybody who looked up the Oxford English Dictionary could find the word, but it was really an abstraction that nobody followed up, nobody cared about. But Catherine and I looked at misandry as a kind of collective neurosis, and we diagnosed the 8 or 9 characteristic features of it. And then we proposed that ultimately there is a way of counteracting this, and that is what we call intersexual dialogue. And dialogue is not just a fancy word for a conversation or a national debate or a national dialogue. Dialogue is one end of a continuum. At the other end, the end of the continuum, one end is dialogue, which is a ritualized form or expression of intimacy. And debate is closer to the other end of the continuum, the end of which is war. So dialogue and debate are not synonymous, but they're both a whole lot better. Well, they're certainly better than warfare. The idea is that within the realm of time and space, which is to say the world of everyday life, we have to find a way of relating to each other that has within it the potential for healing and reconciliation. So dialogue, we outline 10 principles of dialogue that would have to be internalized in some way, either before or during the process. And that includes just obvious things such as approaching the other, and there is an other, by not expecting their own preconceived ideas to be confirmed. In other words, the point is to learn something about the other that you don't know or think you know.
Epistemic humility, the fancy term.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's right. So there are 8 or 9 other characteristic features of that kind. And our hope was that people could just get together in groups and try to foster something based on that. But I'm not so sure now. I'm not so sure. We are so far from dialogue. It is so remote that, as I sometimes say, peace in the Middle East is more likely in our time.
Yeah. And it kind of took a Trump to get us closer to that than the other option, which is ironic.
Yes, it is. And he did the right thing. But at the moment, I think, for the past 5 years, in fact, I think that we are so remote from dialogue that maybe we just need to prepare for it for some future time, probably long after I'm gone. But I want to keep that ideal alive.
I've been speaking with a lot of feminists and exploring a lot of perspectives from females by being as self-effacing as possible, by just listening as possible. That's left a gap in my work about what is the man? How do we conceive of the man? Could you, well, I guess we would have to define both women and men, but do you have any ideas to help us conceptualize those concepts?
Well, for one thing, I think we need to seriously question or challenge the currently prevailing idea that there's no such thing as men and women. There are only these gender identities that are fluid and flowing, but I begin with the idea that sex, not gender, sex, is in fact biologically determined. I mean, that's just a fact, whether we like it or not. So that's a thorny thicket today, because we have people who are arguing that even the word mother is now no longer legitimate in the halls of Congress. We have only birthing people and other people. So now I'll tell you, I'm not a feminist, but I agree with feminists who argue that the trans movement is a real threat to women. I do agree with that. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I would do is just argue that to be a man or a woman means to be a combination of both nature and culture. Nature being the biological component, and gender being the cultural component. So gender is a kind of expansion or elaboration or commentary on the raw material from genetics.
Okay. And
gender does, in fact, vary a great deal from one culture to another, although it doesn't vary as much as you might think. There's some things that seem to be constant.
Is the category of man, is developing a category of man and a category of woman that is more or less porous and fluid and conformist and stereotypical, is that useful in proceeding toward a dialogue between what the female experience is and all the varieties of female experience, and then the male experience and all that varieties, and then getting them into some sort of harmonious, more or less harmonious relationship where they can sustain the continuation of our species?
Well, the harmony that you speak of, I mean, there's a presupposition, I think. And that presupposition is not just liking each other, but needing each other. I mean, we have evolved to be dependent on each other. We are not, human beings are social beings. We're not autonomous ever. And so if you say that the goal of every person, every individual, should be a completely autonomous person, you're not talking about a human being, you're talking about a fantasy. Mm-hmm. There was a very good documentary that I saw at a film festival a few years ago. It was called Women and Men Unglued. And I don't know, not the author, the person who made the filmmaker, interviewed, it was not a scientific study, she interviewed about 40 people, most of whom were white, but not all, most of whom were upwardly mobile, professional people, but not all. So it wasn't exact, you couldn't say it was a representative sample. Nevertheless, it was very illuminating. Because here were all these people who were basically saying something very similar. They were asked, for example, are they planning to marry? And most of them said that they would like to, but they don't foresee it. And the reason that the filmmaker, who was also a talking head, Barbara Whitehead, who wrote The Divorce Culture and various other classics, but her idea was that these men and women that she interviewed did not need each other. There was no reason for them, apart from emotional gratification on a largely transient basis. Okay. There was no reason for them to marry. There was no reason for them to have children or to place themselves in the context of history from present to future. And these people, many of them, expressed regret. They regretted that. They didn't know how to get back to what their parents had, which they envied, but they regretted it. It was not good to be alone. Mm-hmm. So I think this need to be needed is something that we really have to take seriously. And in fact, my whole theory of how to establish a masculine identity that is healthy for both men and women. Mm-hmm. But it does rest on the idea that if men cannot contribute something to society that is A, distinctive, B, necessary, and 3, culturally rewarded, then men cannot have a healthy identity. Now, or not, of course, I'd say the same thing about women or any group in itself. But the thing about women is that there's still one thing about women that is distinctive, necessary, and publicly valued, and that is motherhood. Now, they don't all want to be mothers, and they're not all good mothers. That's true. But nevertheless, even within that context, it's a part of their identity, whether they're actually mothers or not. Because along with motherhood goes a whole range of other qualities that they do value. And that usually is the caring, sharing, and loving, and nurturing, and all that kind of stuff. Which they regard as their turf, whether they're mothers or not. That is their turf. And so when people come along who question that, their response is a very brittle, hostile one. The 3 things that men have historically done: progenitor or fatherhood, protector, and provider. Well, provider and protector are already being done by the state. Yeah. So the state has really usurped that aspect of masculinity. So in a sense, you could argue, and I do argue, that single women, especially by choice, they are, in effect, they are marrying the state. Now, there's only one thing that is still possible for men, and that is fatherhood. But the problem with fatherhood is that it is now either trivialized or demonized. It's trivialized by arguing that, well, men are just assistant mothers. So there's nothing distinctive that they have to bring to that, but they can help out. They can do diapers, yes, they can play around with the children, but that is not, you see, what fatherhood has traditionally meant. That's very nice if fathers do that. And it's very nice if fathers have a strong emotional rapport with their children. But that wasn't how fatherhood was defined. It was defined as bringing children into the larger world. So the mother has been the one who provides children with unqualified, unconditional love. So a mother can say to her child, honestly, I will always love you, even if you turn out to be Al Capone, you're still my child and I still love you. But a father's job is to say that a father's job is to teach children about earned respect, not about love, about earned respect, which is not incompatible with love, but it's something different. It means that, so a father will say to a child in not these words, but in effect, I will respect you if you earn it. If you act in the larger world with integrity, with honor, then of course you will earn my respect. And that's the job of a child, is to earn the respect of a father. So as I say, they're not the same thing, but the difference is, I think, either ignored entirely, often for political reasons, but it's also trivialized and sometimes demonized. If you begin to believe, as some women do, that fathers are really potential molesters, not only walking wallets, but potential molesters, then that really undermines that part of a masculine identity, which still is hanging on by a thread. If we lose that, I don't know where else to go.
You're bringing up something that's very profoundly, my imagination wants to map it onto the world, onto America's education system, going away from merit, actually rapidly destroying merit in favor of belonging, inclusion, and equity, which are all synonymous. They're all synonyms for love, unconditional love, but they're corporatized and they're perverted in this satanic way, but that's a whole other conversation. But also the intrusion of the media into children's sexuality, the media being the one who trains the child and shows the child and brings the child into the world, both through cartoons or static media that's coming at them from a screen, and also social media too. You get trained by your peer group more and more and more, and less by your parents.
That's right. So parents, in a sense, are almost obsolete, and men are almost obsolete. More and more of their functions being taken over by the state. And if not by the state, then even worse, possibly, or maybe not, by popular culture, by social media, ads and commercials, celebrity culture. These are all things that are at the core of creating chronological adults who are not necessarily emotional adults. Heather McDonald has written a great deal about what she calls safetyism. And that's the idea that's the helicopter parent idea, that parents must protect their children from every conceivable harm, not only from, drowning in rivers, but also, God forbid, somebody should insult them or subtly, microaggress against them. These are all things that are undermining their resilience. And at the same time, this thing called safetyism is heavily linked to, if not, feminism, I would say, but even more than feminism, it's just the idea that motherhood is the paradigm of all human activities. And therefore, if you cannot express your love in a particular way, which is emotional, not intellectual, but emotional, then you are repressed and you need psychotherapy. And the American Psychological Society just came up with this brand new version of its guide to clinicians who have male patients. So you've heard about the controversy over that, because basically that's just feminism translated into the idiom of ideological feminism.
Which is basically that men are fallen creatures and must be made aware of that. Yeah.
That's right.
Is this, in a sense, not the utopia then? We're living in this worldwide womb where everything is information is just hanging from trees, and we don't have to worry about resilience anymore. We don't have to worry about any slight other than the fact that we have to worry about it more and more and more. But isn't this kind of the promised land in a way of plenty?
I think it's an illusion of the promised land. I mean, I don't think that paradise actually exists, but I think that it's the paradigm of paradise yet to come. It's what they're working for. But before they can get there, they have to destroy everything that exists right now. Everything. It's not just, they don't just want political reform here and there, a new law now and then. What they want is the complete destruction of every institution. The feminists began by deconstructing the family, but with the addition of wokism, every institution, including the law. So, for example, they are undermining the notion of due process. They have rehabilitated the notion of vigilantism, bypassing the law. These are all linked. They're not separate phenomena. They're all linked.
Mm-hmm. And with regards to bypassing due process, that's in Title IX is a good example of that, and the way that colleges are prosecuting sexual harassment claims. And the vigilantism is put on full display in Portland, Oregon. If anybody out there needs an example,
well, Me Too was the first high profile example, but of course it's now mutated. It's everywhere.
Yeah,
I mean.
It's once the genie's out of the bottle, there's no stopping it. No,
there isn't. Not unless there's some other genie that looks better. but
towards a sexier genie. That's our project, right?
For many years, people told me, well, yes, you've read all these books by feminist ideologues, and you've read all these articles, and we see the signs here and there, but it's really just a bunch of radical students on campuses, and why should we pay attention to that? They'll graduate and grow up and get jobs and get married and what have you. But 5 years ago, that went ballistic. It went viral. It went mainstream. Is what I'm trying to say. So that ideas that were radical even 5 years ago are now considered almost conventional wisdom in some circles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Smash the cis heteronormative patriarchy and colonial decolonize everything, and all of those have a common root. I'm wondering if we can offer, I don't mean this condescendingly, I wonder if we can offer an olive branch to feminists specifically and say, how can they establish their fight for the rights of women? How can they salvage that from how wokeness and the feminist ideologues have taken over it? Is there like a pulling back and a recentering on a really good, solid women's based rights, and then also a flourishing of cultural understanding, respect, and appreciation of the female, and in concert as well form her constructed consort of the same thing in a male? Maybe a redefined chivalry of some sort, some type.
Oh, I hope not. I'm not. No. Because we can talk about that, but that's not one of my solutions.
Okay.
But it's really hard because wokeism has just so solidified and rigidified. I mean, I think that wokeism it clearly grows out of both Marxism and feminism, but it's more primitive and more brutal and coarse. There's no room for subtlety. You either are anti-racist or anti-sexist, or you're nothing.
Or you're a rape and racist apologist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very Manichaean, very dualist.
Now, I'm not going to put myself in the position of advising women. Women can and will do whatever they can and will. That's not my responsibility. Is to make enough room for men so that we all have a seat at the table.
Okay. So what are the actionable steps towards that? You said you pointed towards personal responsibility or having an effect in the world, and you distilled it into 3 good points about doing something distinct, necessary, and publicly rewarded. So doing something in the world is the basis to build from there. Is that kind of where you're headed?
Yes. I mean, basically, when I say that, I'm saying that we need to, if we can't rescue fatherhood, I don't know where else we're going to find it.
Okay.
So in that sense, in a purely practical sense, the battlefront has to do with custody cases, and it has to do with all the legal provisions that either ignore father, or in fact, they often ignore both mother and father. There are some places, some jurisdictions in which birth certificates no longer say mother or father; they say parent 1, parent 2. So we're rapidly losing any kind of contact or memory of things that have served the human race really quite well over the past million years or so. And in fact, one of our books, called Replacing Misandry, is a look at the past 12,000 years in human history as a series of cultural and technological revolutions that have changed our ways of perceiving men and women. For example, at one time, the male body was a community resource. They needed male bodies. There were some things that had to be done, and men could do them, on the whole, better than women. But then, with the coming of agriculture and then industry, you have, the male body is no longer a source of identity. Yes, you have the aristocracies that survive, maintain some vestigial sense that, they go hunting or something, and that gives them a vestigial sense of manhood. But in fact, men with the highest status are those who do not have to use their male bodies in that way. On the contrary, the ideal man, at least in upper class circles for the past 200 or 300 years, has been somebody who does not work, does not produce. So that this increasing divorce of the male body itself as a source of identity is just another one of these troubling things.
So is the solution to dig a ditch once a week?
No, it's not. It's not, because that would be, an empty ritual. That's not with no connection with reality.
Yeah. Well, okay. That was facetious, but also is working out a way of getting reconnected to the body. Are you suggesting that men should get in touch with their body, or is it more about society needing that, and without that we have to find another way of being needed? Yeah,
it's society. I'm not really concerned about individuals and their individual bodies. Sure, work out. I mean, I don't, because I'm too lazy, but that's my problem.
You aristocrat, you.
Lazy, that's the word. But You see, we're no longer naive. Most people understand that we are products of both nature and culture. But if you look at culture carefully, you see that it's a tissue of reality and fantasy, and it's a whole bunch of things. It's not easy to pull apart if you intend to put it back together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what we have now, another way of with the population is very polarized, partly politically and religiously, and in every conceivable way. Mm-hmm. Another word, though, from polarization is fragmentation. What we have now is no longer a society that coheres. It's a fragmented collection of individuals or individual groups within society, each of which is saying, we're out for our ends and devil take the hindmost. Now, that's not a recipe for a society, for any kind of renewed society.
Do you think that is, to kind of backtrack a little bit to the really broader issues, do you think that that's the outcoming of, we can theorize about where this came from, the balkanization. James Lindsay's done a lot of work explaining how Hegel has informed every step of the way of wokeness. And it's very convincing to me. I'm not a Hegel scholar at all, but watching those ideas go through and manifest across the board, you use a term a little bit closer to me because I'm a kind of a mythological guy of dualism. There's this dualism. Have you seen in history the rise of dualism and then its resolution back into a dialectic, or return to a non-dualist framework?
Now that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. I can certainly see eruptions of dualism. To take one example, after the unification of Spain in the late 15th century, the first thing that Ferdinand and Isabel did was they expelled Jews in 1492, and then they expelled the Muslims in 1498, and then they set up the Inquisition in order to be sure that there were no secret Jews or Muslims or heretics of any other kind. So it was the process of unifying the state really meant eliminating any potential others. And I don't know that they ever really got past that.
Do you think to this day they're still working out the reverberations of that move?
Not in Spain, but elsewhere in Europe.
Okay.
No, in Spain, actually. There actually are Jews in various rural parts of Spain who had a few customs that they didn't really understand. They were Catholics, very believing, pious Catholics, but every Friday night they lit candles in the basement. And so they didn't really understand that. But then more recently, it's come to light that they, in fact, did have Jewish ancestors. And I think that Spain, as a modern state, has actually encouraged some reckoning with that history. And certainly Germany has done a lot because, short of bringing back the dead, they have done a lot to counteract any residue of National Socialism. Mm-hmm. They haven't done it perfectly, but they've really done a good job. I go to Goethe Institute here, at least I used to, and I got very familiar with their film culture, which is heavily reliant on the notions of forgiveness and reconciliation, whether it was with Jews or with communists or what have you. So that's an example of a country that I think has done quite a good job of that. I don't know that I'm not sure that they're creating a paradise either, but at least they've seen the danger of what can happen when people allow dualism to go rampant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think our current media culture, and it's going to be this way for a while, is focused on representation and empowerment, which seems to be kind of not the exact opposite of forgiveness and reconciliation, but it's more about the individual. It's more about the individual and the identity than it is about the community and communion or atonement. So it's heading in a completely different direction, more and more atomized and yet pseudo collectivized, representative kind of stuff.
Well, I think it's sometimes hard to distinguish between hardcore individualism and this new level of individualism, which is the collective, the ethnic or racial or sexual identity, divorced really from the needs or interests of society as a whole. Mm-hmm. So it's individualism, but it's at the group level, not the societal level, but the group level. It's somewhere in the middle.
Interesting. So it's, okay. So it doesn't really actually get into the individual, nor does it get into the community. It has kind of a simulation of both in this collective, individualistic or identitarian kind of intersectional
matrix. I think that matrix is philosophically and morally incompatible with anything that we would consider, that anything that comes out of the Western tradition of philosophy and morality. Now, whether they can make something good out of it, I don't know. But so far, the signs are so atrocious, are so hideous. Look, about 5 years ago, there were 3 or 4 articles that appeared in major newspapers. One was the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Huffington Post, and I think 1 or 2 others. And all 3 of these newspapers ran articles. Well, they had titles like, Why Not Hate Men? Why Can't Women Hate Men? That was one. Another one was about a mother who worries that she cannot love her son because he's going to grow up to be a man.
Yeah, he's basically a rapist already.
So, now it's true that these articles got very harsh feedback, but the fact that they could even reach national prominence in respectable publications, that says something to me.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the respectability of those particular organizations, they've been very quickly expending all of that built up.
Well, they don't have my. I read the New York Times every day for at least 30 years. And I love the quality of the literary quality and the provocative article. But 5 years ago, in the run-up to the election of Trump, I could not read it. I just could not stand it. I had to stop because it was so wildly and overtly, so explicitly hostile to anybody except their own clique, as it were, that it was an alienating experience par excellence.
So to kind of back up and maybe get back, you've done a lot of work studying the relationship between males and females, the relationship between society and men, yet you kind of have an outsider status because of your sexuality. That's something that puts you on the outside of that procreative tussle, or does it? Has that informed, and how has that informed your work, and what insights do you think that has given you into being able to look at this?
Well, first of all, I think that all outsiders see the world in a way that is significantly different and therefore very valuable to the insiders. So that's one thing. But you're right. I'm an outsider in several ways, actually, but that's certainly one of them. I don't, my interest in the family is not it's not primarily about the mechanisms for reproducing children. I mean, it does involve that, but, and I don't do that. Now, I was involved in the debate over gay marriage, and I took the extremely unpopular point of view that I did not think I was not in favor of gay marriage. My main reason was that I think children need both a mother and a father. That is the ideal context for bringing up children. A father and a mother who don't do the same thing. I don't think, but I had other reasons too. I thought that the reasoning of the movement for gay marriage was based on very, very shaky ground. The only thing that they ever said that I thought made sense was that in the States, unlike Canada, which didn't have universal Medicare, it was not fair that some people got to cash in on the Medicare of their spouse and other people didn't. Mm-hmm. Of course, the answer to that isn't gay marriage. The answer is to have universal medical coverage. But the other reasons were very unsatisfying. For example, the idea was that if you can't marry and have children, you're not going to be as respectable as other people. But why should respectability be a criterion that takes precedence over the good of children? These arguments I did not buy.
Did they not align with what I perceive of as one of your foundational values of constellating the individual in relationship with the community? The arguments weren't serving the community. They were going too far towards just serving the individual and not serving society as a whole.
Well, serving the individual, but mainly serving the identity group.
Okay. At the expense, or not even at the expense, but maybe at the expense of society, but
I would say at the expense of society, to the extent that children, and they do have children often, whether they're adopted or whether they're from earlier relationship. I mean, many do have children, but they're rejecting the idea that children actually need mothers and fathers. I think that's a fundamental mistake.
I wonder if that, not only because of the children and their needs and the overlapping stereotypical responsibilities of the male and the female, but also because it destabilizes a lot of males from having that anchor in fatherhood. It has broader societal effects beyond, once you loosen the child from the father, then what does a man become? Is that kind of
yes
question? And then what do you
well, of course, all of my research and activities are in some way connected to the needs and problems of specifically of men.
Okay.
Boys and men. So, although I don't do any research on this of my own, but I'm certainly aware of the research on, the fact that boys are dropping out of school at much higher rates than girls. They're falling behind at every level of education. And then there's the suicide rate among men is much higher than that of women. Now, I'm not a sociologist, but I know enough to know that these are symptoms of underlying problems. What is going on with these men and boys? They're certainly not acting as if they feel happy-go-lucky and privileged, and there's something going on that is not right for them.
Yeah.
So I think we need to account for that, and not by relying on feminist ideology, which very often blames men themselves for their own problems. But we have to actually ask men what it would mean to be fully human. You know, one thing that I did in some classes, I don't give classes anymore, but I used to, and classes on feminism or women's studies, occasionally I'd be asked to give a lecture. My first question in the class was I always asked, tell me one thing that you admire about men. One thing. I asked everybody to do that, submit it on a piece of paper, nothing public. First of all, not everybody even answered the question. And of those who did, many said things like, well, I admire a man who has a sense of humor, or who strives, or what. But I mean, these are all things that are equally true of women. They couldn't identify one characteristic of men that is distinctive, necessary, and should be, therefore, publicly valued. So that's an exercise that I would certainly use again. Tell me one thing, about men, as men per se, that you consider admirable. It's a hard question.
So, if you have any advice for somebody who wants to help men, or help society help understand what men are going through, what's the clue or the thread to start to investigate, or what's some possible even answers to that?
Well, these are people who know there's a problem, or people who are not aware that there's a problem?
Well, I guess awareness would be one part, and then also I'm part of my audience are men, and they're watching things and they're not happy with things. But I take hope in the Jordan Peterson's effect on a lot of people, men and women alike, of giving them all a sense of responsibility. And that has changed a lot, both men and women, and all these different identities that I speak to. He's a common thread of something. So he's pushing something that's really basic and really necessary that people haven't been hearing. So
yes, he is. And I give him credit, because there have been attempts before, well-meaning attempts. I mean, in the 80s, there was, Robert Bly and people like that who were saying things like, well, we have to, find some real, authentic masculinity. And so to do that, he basically ransacked as many cultures as he could find and chose, a myth from here and a ritual from there. And, then they all went out in the woods and did their speaking tom-toms. Anyway, I think that was maybe a beginning, maybe a good beginning, but really that's so superficial compared to what we really need.
Okay. So what's on a deeper level? What do you think that men need? What do men need right now?
They need a healthy identity.
Which is one that's not perceived of as toxic, as mansplaining,
That's
as
right.
the aggressor.
That's right. Exactly.
Represented by the 2% of them that do all the crimes.
That is what we need. And a healthy, and it must be respected and honored by society. Just to take one example of countless, Judaism is very family oriented, and fathers are rewarded symbolically in many ways. One of them is that a father will go to the synagogue with his sons and cover them all with the talit, the prayer shawl, and pray. That's a public honor. And the message that gets across is it's good to be a father, and it's necessary. And in religious circles, of course, to be a father is partly to teach Torah to their children. When my parents were about to get married, it wasn't just that they wanted to get married. It was also a duty, a communal duty to the Jewish community to marry and have children, to perpetuate Torah.
It seems like the Blythian way was another identitarian way, or like it is more about like male identity as some sort of performative act. What you're talking about specifically within the Jewish tradition, even the performances are tied to the family. Like when the man performs something that's only for the man to perform, it's in relationship to his sons, and the bond, the oath that is made between the man and the woman is to perpetuate something that precedes and needs to proceed through them. So there's this chaining and this tying and this boundedness that from which the man derives his identity, which is not just this spectral identity that we are seeing right now in our culture that's unattached to anything other than people seeing you as you want to be seen. It's actually you're enmeshed in a product and in a productive project that spans eons. So there's that context.
Exactly.
Okay.
You hit it right neatly.
Okay. So your ultimate advice is not to dig ditches, but have a family. Get hitched, guys. Discover yourself.
Well, no, I can't say that. Who am I to tell other people what to do? I'm not going to do that. But I will. About the very least that they can do is to honor and help those who do get married and have children.
Okay. Yeah. Well, what are you doing for the rest of the day? Oh, wait, I'm going to close up the podcast before we get to personal matters, if you don't mind me asking and chatting. Thank you so much, Paul, for coming on my channel and sharing your research with us.
It's been a pleasure.
Congratulations for reaching the end of the discussion. If you enjoyed it, do be sure to leave a review or a comment or a thumbs up or whatever you need to do to show that glorious algorithm that this is some good stuff. And do be sure to go and check that back catalog, as it is brimming full of fantastic conversations. Links to provide monetary support are down there in the description as well. Have a good night.